A very warm welcome. You're joining us at Hyde Park on Ada Derana 24. We're talking about economic recovery, growth prospects for Sri Lanka. But what of Sri Lanka's peoples? Development, mindfulness, achieving aspirations of the young people. We'll talk about all that, but how we should move ahead as a nation to achieve what we desire and what we aspire to be. I've invited to our studios Professor SUNIL Kariyakarawana. Dr. Kariyakarawana, a very warm welcome. Ayubowan to you. You're here visiting Sri Lanka briefly from the UK. Buddhist advisor to now His Majesty's three armed forces, and also a former lecturer, senior lecturer at the University of Kelaniya some 35 years ago, but for the past 20 years has been in the UK, working with the UK's Defence Ministry and advising the late Queen, Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, and now it's a king there in the UK. Tell us a little about your visit and how the UK is doing. We hear it's chaotic there. We saw 3 prime ministers in 3 months rather, and the Queen, the late Queen herself, welcomed and bid farewell to 2 prime ministers in a row. Tell us what's happening there.
Thank you for having me, Indeewari. Lovely to be here with you as usual. Yes, it's been a quite a dramatic few months in the UK. We lost Her Majesty the Queen, and we actually lost few prime ministers in the process as well. It is indeed kind of a strange time. Now we have a prime minister from an Asian origin, and UK kind of there's a bit of a transition time, and I think people are just still kind of digesting what is happening in the country. But I think it's in a way this was all brought about by the COVID and aftermaths of COVID and so on. But I think I'm really glad to see some stability. There was a misuse of the word growth, but I think what is really more important is the stability, and people realize that. I think we are slowly on that track.
Compared to the UK?
well, I mean, in Sri Lanka, we have had very difficult several months and so on. And I think this is all over the world, I think, with COVID and so on. But I think, what is really, what I see this as an opportunity. I always say opportunity in adversity. When the situations and adverse, things happen, I mean, we really learn to learn our ropes and come back, into our senses and so on. So every man is a pilot in the calm sea, So I think when things happen, being able to bounce back, and that's kind of the definition of sustenance and resilience. Resilience is our ability to bounce back. So I think we are doing just that.
I'm not sure whom you're referring to at times as us, we, because at times to the UK and at times in Sri Lanka. So I understand you have your roots strongly here in Sri Lanka, and you've embraced the UK as your own country. You've lived there, and you've contributed to that economy, to the people of that economy. How did it feel during the times of crisis and the peak of the adversity here, as a man of Sri Lankan origin, looking at Sri Lanka from the UK?
Actually, to tell you the fact, I mean, we were all disturbed. I mean, Sri Lankans, I'm sure this is the same feeling for all Sri Lankans abroad. And, especially, when you are outside of the country, you feel for the country much more than when you are in. So, and I think our feeling was, well, and I think, Sri Lanka, such a, amazing country with so much potential and everything. So when you actually meet your friends, like, UK friends and other countries, and it wasn't very impressive time for any of us, and we were really concerned, especially with food security. Sri Lanka, country with so much vegetation, and throughout the year you can grow things, and there is a food security issues, and it was really concerning for all of us, to tell you the fact.
How do we convert that feeling of sorrow and that sentiment that our Sri Lankans living overseas have into a dollar inflow into the country? How do we look at that? Because I know Sri Lankans feel very closely, they feel sad, but how do we create an avenue for our Sri Lankans to contribute to the development and achieving stability of the nation going forward?
Really good question. I think this is, you really hit the nail on the head. Like, how could we actually transform that? I mean, I said opportunity in adversity, and the real opportunity here is to reflect back and see where we have gone wrong. And the biggest issue is this word trust in Sri Lanka, because, and I think, one of the things that we have lost in our political, social, cultural, areas is this word trust. And I think with, we really don't seem to understand the significance of that. I mean, this, Sri Lanka, we made the first woman prime minister in this country. Our literacy rate so high, all the positive things about Sri Lanka, the hospitality and all of that. But still, for all, for us to fall into a situation like what we had last few months was really unexpected, to say the least. Yeah.
But we know Sri Lankans protest overseas also about what's happening here. How do we transform that protests into an actual contribution so that they will also feel part of the development and growth strategy in Sri Lanka?
I think my answer again is winning the trust, and actually, and creating a credible image. And this is what we are really lacking, our credibility, Sri Lanka has had that credibility around the world, and I think so, unfortunately, past few decades, our politics and our ways we were dealing with the outside world has not been credible enough. And even now, when I find that I'm not actually pointing fingers at any political hues and political parties and this and that, but it is so important, Indeewari, for us to reflect back and see where we have gone wrong. And in my view, it is the way to actually regain that lost trust is to listen to each other. I think within the country, there is this key word dialogue. And I think we don't seem to understand the meaning of dialogue at all. It is like, it feels more like a monologue, because where each person is, speaking out and not hearing each other. I could be speaking to you and you are speaking to me. We are not hearing each other. And I think the recent uprising and all of this was an opportunity for us to listen to each other and respect each other. And in the military, we have what we call 6 core values. it's called C drills, courage, discipline, integrity, loyalty, respect for others, and selfless commitment. And I think some of these are so important to have, for us to have some values and standards. You can, as somebody said, you can fool some people sometime. You can fool some people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Was it in Winston Churchill or somebody said? So I think we actually should understand that we cannot fool all the people all the time. So and the best way is, honesty is the best policy, and I think we need to learn from these situations and change our attitudes, our perceptions, and how we go about doing our politics, our business. This is time for reflection.
You said opportunities in adversity, and you mentioned politicians as well. I'm not sure if adversity is always an opportunity just for the politicians, but for the people of Sri Lanka, where they could also thrive and benefit out of these tough times, but the reforms that we need to bring in. You've been living outside the country for more than 35 years, as I mentioned before, 20 odd years in the UK. And in Japan, to US, to Canada, to other European countries. You've visited there, you've lived there, and you know what it is. So how do we bring this change in attitude and patterns of thinking to benefit out of an adverse situation, to transform that adversity into an opportunity?
Thank you for that. Actually, that could be actually misinterpreted and misconstrued as in a negative way, like, taking advantage of a situation. That is not what I really meant. What I really meant was, as we say, the old worldly vicissitudes, gain and loss, fame and defame, happiness and sorrow, and, Ashtaloka Dharma, all these, when we are faced with these situations, we need to maintain our equilibrium, maintain our balance, and that is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is actually, transform, and it is time for reflection. And I think, I cannot overemphasize the word reflection, contemplation, mindfulness. This is a very key word, and where we really need to be mindful and step outside of it and say, where have we gone wrong, what can we do, and what is the best course of action in this sort of a scenario, rather than repeating the same old mistakes over and over again. And I think this is where Sri Lanka, and even around the world, we really need to learn. The Buddha, actually quite a few times emphasizes this point to the monks and says, if somebody is actually critical of you, just stop and reflect back and say, why and how did it, we go wrong like this. So, and I think this is a really good time for us to stop and reflect.
You mentioned the Ashtaloka Dharma, the 8 worldly conditions preached by the Buddha. We say labha, alabha, ayasa, yasa, but then we say these are about praise and blame, facing fear and happiness at the same time, pain and yet happiness. So with all this, with Sri Lanka, with India, Sri Lanka, with this subcontinent being where the Buddhist philosophy has been practiced, we see that these matters are well taken and practiced in the Western world. There's a Buddhist chaplain to the armed forces in the UK. You're the advisor to the 3 armed forces in terms of Buddhism. You advise Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen, and now His Majesty King Charles. We're so used to calling him Prince Charles. So now from Queen to King. They've embraced the Buddhist philosophy. It's not about a religion, but the philosophy itself. So how do we use that in Sri Lanka in comparison to how the UK and other countries are adopting?
You know, really good question to ask, Indeewari, because I think, you know, we are really not short of our ability to bounce back. And, you know, I think Sri Lanka, you know, we have been through so much and we always go through difficult times. And I think, I mean, you know, to give you one example, when we were having this, you know, really difficult few months, with, you know, fuel shortages, the gas shortages, and the, you know, all these shortages, and you know, I was just turning the TV on, and I saw that on Poson full moon day, how much generosity was practiced in this country. You know, it was just amazing to see, you know, people who are experiencing so many difficulties, but yet practicing generosity and, you know, for the well-being of others. So I do not think that it is in a kind of bone structure to keep on complaining about anything. So we are well placed to bounce back at adversity. But I think, you know, what really happened was in the you know, UK and the European context, the Western world, they actually practice Buddhism much more. If I, you know, I'm a bit reluctant to say this, but I see, you know, my 35 years of experience show me that actually, you know, how much people actually practice Buddhism, and the number of Buddhists have increased over, you know, last 2 decades. You know, from 200,000 to even more than 2 million in UK alone. And so,
although they don't carry the Buddhist label,
yes,
they practice the philosophy.
That's right. And you know, what I really see is there's so much learning and contemplation, reflection, meditation. Mindfulness is a kind of $1 million industry in UK and the Western world. So there is so much for us to learn from that country, because, you know, I saw that people were queuing up and, you know, dying out in here and actually collapsing and dying in petrol queues in this country. And I think, you know, there are situations like that all over the world, but I think our ability to face these situations with some composure, with some understanding is also equally important. But at the same time, taking enough action to remedy those, you know, permanent solutions, you know, rather than tinkering them and finding sort of short-term, you know, solutions.
You mentioned about composure, Dr. Kariyakarawala. Again, going back to your role of an advisor in Buddhism to the 3 armed forces in the UK, have we lost composure here and there and most of the time? Because we saw violence in Sri Lanka in ways that we haven't in recent decades. We've spoken about the 80s, the violence there. How did Sri Lankans become so violent in a country that Buddhism, peace, and the essence of forgiveness is taught?
Yes, I mean, it's kind of, there's a two sides of the same coin. And actually, on one hand, when people are faced with these extraordinary situations, you know, economic downturns and, you know, actually, you know, even the basics, you know, of you know, lack of electricity, this and that, and you can understand the frustrations, you know, people go through. But at the same time, how we respond, actually every action has a reaction, and I think this you know, escalation takes place when the responses, you know, I mean, I just was driving through yesterday through the Gold Face, and I was really amazed that the police numbers were numbering the people who were protesting there, which was not, I would not have expected that, and I would really like to see, people being heard in a very, like non-aggressive and peaceful manner. And I think so no need of escalation. And I think most of these situations take place because of these few people who are escalating these, things. So composure in that sense is so important.
You were former senior lecturer in clinical linguistics and translation methods at the University of Colombo in the early 80s or mid-80s?
Mid-80s.
Mid-80s. Yeah. From there to now, let's talk about youth empowerment. You said opportunities in adversity, but in creating opportunities for the young people, youth, who are the future of this country, how do we create that policy balance to bring in the youth into policy making, making them a part of the reform agenda and actually creating opportunities?
That's a really good question. Because I think, as you know, that youth is the future of this of any nation, and I think in Sri Lanka in particular, what you see is so much potential of the people. But if people had no creativity, they will be much more silent and so on. But I think when you really see some noise coming, and you should ask why people are making noise, because they actually have some ideas. We should not really take those negatively, and I think there are those several factors, congregating factors here in Sri Lanka. One thing is our potential is very high. Youth, I mean, even in any corner of the country, they are well read, well educated, and average youth is so well placed to take part in our activities. When you compare to some of the countries and some of the communities, ours literacy rate is very high, educated youth. So not giving them the opportunities, and I'm so surprised in our parliament. Like our Prime Minister in the UK, Rishi Sunak, is just 42. I mean, would we have somebody with that age becoming a Prime Minister in this country? I doubt it. Yeah. So there is a great need for us to see, realize the potential of young people, energetic people. I'm not actually campaigning for any political party to be appointed or gain power or anything. But I think overall, young youth, empowerment in Sri Lanka is so vitally important. And these elderly people after 60s, 70s, why do they really continue to propagate their own family politics, and they should actually retire and make way for the young, youth, energetic people to come forward and rule this country.
I think it's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. We'll return to discuss more. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. We are in conversation with Dr. SUNIL Kariyakarawala, also an associate professor at the Free University of Amsterdam, a former senior lecturer at the Colombo University, and still retaining your position as the advisor, Buddhist Chaplain to the 3 armed forces in the UK. You also advise the King now, and formerly the Queen. Tell me how you engage in that. What kind of advisory, what kind of consultations do they seek as leaders of a nation? I mean, we see how in times of adversity, although the Queen herself did not run the country, She had her own family issues as well, and as to protect the monarchy, to protect, to maintain that public image, to maintain composure. So how do they seek consultation from you?
Well, historically, as you know, with, the royal family and the government, they really want to see these minority communities are catered for equally. So with the majority. So they wanted to appoint advisors from each faith, and this is where the Buddhism came into being. And 2005 in the parliament, they were asking the question like, we are going and waging wars in these other countries, and where are our advisors to the Islamic faith, the Hindu and Sikh and the Jewish and the Buddhist. So so that is how my appointment came into being. But whenever the Queen goes out to a Buddhist nation, and she wanted to make sure that she's not misbehaving, in the sense that she's doing the right thing, and how she meets and greets people and not offending culture, religion. Now that really shows the level of sensitivity and paying attention to even the minor areas. So that is where my job started, and then there are over 6,000 serving Buddhists in the British Armed Forces, spread across the British Isles and beyond, all four forces. And so my job on a daily basis is to look after them, their identity, and representing them at different levels, and advising the chain of command. And we have a 3-star general championing us. So it's such an incredible, and I think learning time for all of us. So what I really admire in this whole process is their openness to embrace and engage and cater for the minority faiths and the communities. So last 18 years I have actually worked very hard in establishing those.
You mentioned about Rishi Sunak. The latest story from the UK is that I think a 3rd-generation Indian immigrant, of course they were based in Kenya, I think his grandparents, but in the UK of Indian origin becomes the Prime Minister. But how do we create that opportunity for people of different ethnic groups in Sri Lanka? Our war, for 3 decades we fought a war based on ethnicity, language, and we've seen uprisings, we've seen riots based on religion, faith. But this is, again, we go back to saying we preach every day, we talk about forgiveness, we talk about coexistence. So moving forward, as we look at a new Sri Lanka, a Sri Lanka that's reforms and policy agenda based, how do we also bring in that opportunity where all ethnic groups are able to coexist and have that Rishi Sunak story in Sri Lanka? We gave the world's first female prime minister, and this was not just in recent times, but decades ago.
Absolutely, I know, spot on. And I think this is a really important time for us to again reflect deeply. And Sri Lanka, we are never short of surprising the world, as you said, with the first ever woman prime minister. So this Rishi Sunak story tells us something about a good opportunity for us to look back and say, how can we actually really learn something from this situation. So I think, in my view, I mean, until he was appointed, nobody even ever thought of having somebody Asian with Asian origin being appointed as the prime minister. But I think the UK communities, I mean, I think by and large, I see last 22 years so much has changed in the country in terms of attitudes and perceptions. So, and I think, you know, with regard to a lesson for Sri Lanka, I mean, my vision, you know, as a you know, loyal Sri Lankan myself, I would have liked to see the minority, you know, leaders taking some leadership. I mean, you know, when Lakshman Kadiragama was the foreign minister, and you know, he did the job so successfully, I would have expected him to be the prime minister of this country, you know, and would that, you know, unfortunately that never materialized. And I think this is an opportunity for us to engage, embrace, and reach out to our minorities, you know, whether it is religious or ethnic. So, and I think, you know, in the world today, lot is being happening, and I think we need to take those on board and learn from those, you know, what is happening around the world.
Mm-hmm. When I first met you, we spoke on my Sati program, basically mindfulness and lifestyle, where we spoke about Buddhism, how to embrace mindfulness, and later on at Hyde Park as well. This time around, when I spoke to you, your visit in Sri Lanka is related to a project that you've started. You've sold most of your property there in the UK to come back, to return to Sri Lanka, not to return to settle down, but to return with an investment. What made you make this decision?
That is actually a personal decision I made in Indeewari, because I think, you know, we are all complaining about lack of foreign funds and, you know, dollar crisis, and I think rather than actually, you know, talking about it and complaining about it, and I thought I should do something. Mm-hmm. And I saw, you know, some of my properties in the UK, and actually brought those funds here and established this, you know, mindfulness-based eco-tourist project. Mm-hmm. You know, Sri Lanka, you can be so creative. You know, mindfulness has been there for last 2,000 years in this country, and you know, in America now it's a $1 billion industry. So all 500 Fortune, you know, companies are practicing mindfulness, and I think it is time for us to reclaim our patency and
our heritage.
So, so therefore, and I think I thought this is a, you know, really good time for us to bring that back and establish a project. And this project, you know, thank you for bringing it up. And this is for, you know, just to bring our overseas friends here to Sri Lanka and introduce mindfulness in a natural eco settings where they can really enjoy. They love to be, rather than being passive observers and taking pictures and going back, they can come here and, you know, pluck the tea and, you know, make all the cinnamon and, you know, jump into the paddy fields and do all these activities and, you know, learn our cooking lessons from our villagers. So, and there are so many who really want to do that. So, and I think redefining and revolutionizing the eco-tourist philosophy is so vitally important in Sri Lanka. So, you know, this project is for that purpose. And I think, I really hope the tourist the board in Sri Lanka will take this on board, and we can together work with those people who are really, it's such an innovative idea. We presented it to a university in the UK. They were so excited about this project, and they are in the process of endorsing it. And so therefore, and I think this is
university in?
Oh, this is the University of Bradford in the UK. Okay. So we presented, and they were so excited about it. They are in the process of validating it.
And what's next once they validate it?
So once it is done, we establish a link between Sri Lanka and UK.
Right.
So, UK tourists, like eco-tourists, will be coming to Sri Lanka, and then we send some of our students to do the research, study there, and market research, and the segmentation and so on. So there is this engagement between the universities and also the communities as well. So it is a kind of a big project and practical, and bringing some foreign exchange as at the same time giving the best for the tourists.
And this project, once validated by the university, and once people hear of this our conversation tonight, I think most of our expatriates overseas can do similar projects in Sri Lanka, and of course bring their friends to Sri Lanka, of course friends with dollars, friends who spend dollars here, and revive the country. We're talking about tourism, which was hit after the Easter Sunday attacks, and then the fuel crisis and the political crisis here. The image hasn't been so good. But as you say, opportunity in adversity. How do we look at the tourism industry going forward, especially in the winter season there in Europe, when tourists are looking at traveling to warmer destinations? Sri Lanka is definitely a hot pick.
Absolutely, spot on. And I think there's so much to be done in the rethinking to be done in tourist industry in Sri Lanka. I mean, there's a world big conference called WTM, World Travel Market, in the UK, in London, every year. And I see a lot of actually countries coming together and learning from each other. And I think Sri Lanka also needs to engage in that process. And we need to sit down and discuss, what are the ways and means, where can we actually redefine, because it's a very dynamic, robust industry. So where, I mean, throughout the year, somebody can live under a tree in this country. We could actually grow anything throughout the year. So there is so much potential. The water, vegetation, hospitality, and all of these are really plus points. So if we are really serious about tourism, we need to rethink and redefine and revolutionize the eco-tourist philosophy and tourism in general. We have the best beaches, the best mountains, the best rainforests in the world with biodiversity and so on. So nothing. So why are we not taking the full advantage of them and design and encourage our youth, the tour operators, the tour guides, given proper training on those areas, we can actually do marvels. Within few months and let alone few years, we can actually earn so much foreign revenue.
Should we also rebrand Sri Lanka's image overseas? We've been talking a lot about corruption in the country, nepotism. We've been talking about all the negative aspects that any government or any country could have. But you mentioned about building trust among Sri Lankans overseas. So to build trust not only among Sri Lankans overseas, but also investors, potential investors to the country, to do business here. How do we look at rebranding the country, but not just the image, but also sorting out our issues in terms of corruption and other bottlenecks in the
Absolutely. Country? I mean, 2.5 million Sri Lankans abroad, and most of them are highly professional and actually well-to-do people. In the, I was in Hawaii, visiting some Sri Lankans who have done so well, and I don't think we are making the best use of them being there. I mean, India, they have a concept called the people of Indian origin, POI, and they actually engage with them in a very direct way. And I don't see that happening in Sri Lanka, unfortunately. And I think if we actually engage with these 2.5 million Sri Lankans living abroad, much more now, and design. Again, winning trust is fundamentally important. And the second thing is actually, identifying their potential, their abilities, and get them to contribute back to, because there are loads of people who are willing and able to contribute something to Sri Lanka, especially at these difficult times. So engaging with them is vitally important.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to also talk a little about the question of taxation, heavily debated here in Sri Lanka now. For a long time on our business segments on this program, we've been talking about having a wider tax net, introducing tax reforms and improving on tax and revenue collection. In the UK and Western countries, in the US too, tax is a question that we embrace. This is something that people have paid taxes expecting in return from government. But here now the question is whether these taxes are reasonable. Or if we tax, how do we look at a return for the people? So maybe you can share with us your experience living overseas, living in other countries, how we can bring back people's own money to benefit them.
Good question. The word tax has a different connotation in different, settings. And I think you're absolutely right. In the UK, I have been paying, taxes like 40% taxes, and I have never felt bad about paying those taxes because I have actually, been benefited in terms of public transport, in terms of other services they provide. But in Sri Lanka, and I think Sri Lankans are also mature enough to understand, and why the government should actually, impose these taxes. But when you really do not get, those services in time and in the right manner, then there is a major issue. Free education, for example. I always had this idea that I was a product of free education. I should give something back to the country. But sometimes our university population should take this into heart, and they are at the charity of this people, the taxpayers. So therefore they should not misuse that opportunity. Some students go on being in the university for 8-9 years for 4-year degree, and which is totally utterly wrong. And so therefore they should feel responsible, and also when they are in the university, behave properly, make it a learning opportunity rather than ragging and taking revenge from society, and this and that. And I think there's so much that we really need to learn and address in this country. Both academia and the leadership, they should actually directly address these issues rather than keeping it aside. So overall, and I think the question is very relevant, and we should never feel guilty for paying taxes.
Should Sri Lanka's taxpayer bear the cost of students who engage in protests, students who run down the economy, or politicians who engage in corruption, students who remain at university for 9-10 years? So that's a question that's being debated currently. So how do we use that taxpayers' money to benefit the entire society? You were a former university lecturer, and you spoke about ragging here, something very important. It has come to a point where Sri Lanka has to do away with this and find a policy to completely wipe out this negativity that is being circulated and practiced at university level? You might have some insight from your experiences decades ago.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, this is an issue, sensitive issue. I fully understand the sensitivities, and I also think that the youth, you know, taking part in protest and, you know, actually learning and also contributing to current affairs is so common, and it is very well, you know, it should be admired. But at the same time, this responsibility, you know, the freedom and responsibility balance, it is a balancing act, and so therefore, and I think, you know, as somebody who's been at the university for so long, and I have realized that actually we don't seem to be taking enough responsibility for the taxpayers' money, for free education. So therefore, one of the ways that, I mean, everyone has, all the stakeholders really will have to take full responsibility for this, not just the students, but the university administration and the you know, other stakeholders. So we should jointly address these issues and put this menace, ragging, you know, to full stop, and not even letting people actually, you know, I mean, what is this ragging? You know, this is you know, like a Stone Age practice, and we should not, you know, propagate these, you know, this stuff in our universities at all. Look at what is happening in the universities around the world. The old students actually welcome the new students, they show them around, and they make friends with them and support them so positively. And of course, youth, you know, frustration, youth unrest, and all of these should not be propagated in the form of ragging and other things. So therefore, we all have a stake, the parents, the, you know, the governance and the university admin and everybody. So we should move away from these negative practices and make our universities learning, seats of learning. Look at Oxford, look at Cambridge, look at Yale, you know, look at Harvard, and all of these. So why can't our universities be at the top 10, you know, I mean, let alone top 100 universities in the world? And I don't think none of our universities are not even top 2,000. So
you mentioned about universities, and we have very little time, but I have to ask you this question. Two questions in one. We talk about brain drain for years. People like yourself, educated people, have left the country years ago as well. And now we're inviting people to go overseas and bring dollars back. So voluntary brain drain there. And secondly, the student population, you say, why not we return them here? But a large number of students travel overseas for education every year, and there too an outflow of dollars. But why not create that opportunity here in Sri Lanka? So how do we bring that Cambridge to Harvard to all those other universities and create a world-class environment for our young people with that opportunity you're talking about?
Good question once again. And I think, you know, the educated youth in Sri Lanka are so well aware of these, you know, situations. And I think what happens is we tend to lose sight of what is happening around the world. Now look at Singapore, look at Malaysia, look at other, you know, Asian countries. I mean, look at India, where the university education is now top class and, you know, keeping up with other universities in the world. And in Sri Lanka, we are always under these slogans, you know, privatizing, oh, this education. You know, what happens is all our youth are leaving the country. You know, I saw 500 students of ours. Actually, in one university, Dundee University, I heard, and I go and pick up some students almost every week from London Heathrow Airport. So it is so sad when we are short of this foreign currency. Our students have to pay so much money to go abroad. Rather than doing that, why can't we invite those universities to our countries and establish some actually branches here? Malaysia does that, Singapore does that, other Asian countries do that. So we should actually do that rather than, and that way we can curtail and manage this brain drain, and also losing so much of foreign revenue.
Right, right. Well, that's all the time we have on the show tonight, but thank you very much, Dr. Kariyakarawala, for your time here at Hyde Park.
Thank you.
We had with us Professor Sunil Kariyakarawala, Buddhist advisor to His Majesty's Armed Forces, as well as Associate Professor at the Free University of Amsterdam, former Senior Lecturer at the University of Kelaniya, and now an investor and entrepreneur, bringing back and giving back to Sri Lanka in the tourism industry. Thank you very much for joining us at Hyde Park tonight. We'll continue next week as well with yet another interesting conversation at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24.